In Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, there's a scene where Lord Henry Wotton is conversing with the Duchess of Monmouth. And the Duchess, whom Henry familiarly calls Gladys, is praising some of the recent developments of British society in the late 19th century. She says, we have done great things, and we ultimately have developed our society to a very high degree of success. And what does she have in mind? Well, she could have in mind, say, obviously, the wealth of England at this time, 1890, 91. This is the late Victorian age, so certainly the global imperialist holdings of England are not quite necessarily what they were earlier, but there's still a sense that England is the acme of Western civilization. It still holds vast stretches of land throughout the world from which it draws some of its wealth. Not only that, it is a country that can boast the highest achievements in technology, architecture. But beyond that, we can look to the country intellectually, and we can see that this is a country that has produced a lot of innovations in modern science, not least of which would, of course, be Darwin's ideas of speciation developed in Origin of Species and Descent of Man. So there's a sense that at this time in England, there are scientific methods in place that allow scientists, if they follow them, to discover useful truths that anyone can grasp. So that is also a reason for great optimism. Ultimately, what the Duchess believes is that there is such a thing as progress, and that the world has progressed from the ancient days up until the present days, and as the world progresses, it gets better. It gets more civilized, it gets more rarefied, we might say, in using machinery to take away the difficulty of fulfilling the necessities of life. And there's continuing progress toward higher forms of truth. Well, Lord Harry, he goes by in the novel, at least that's what his friends Dorian call him, like Dorian call him, says, I'm much more interested in decay. I'm not interested in development. I'm interested in decay. And in saying this, he is evoking a counter movement, we might say, that grew up in Europe in the middle and late 19th century that often goes by the name of Decadence. In the middle of the century in France, writers like Théophile de Gautier and Charles Baudelaire were expressing frustration with mainstream values. They believed that the pursuit of wealth, they believed that the pursuit of truth were frustrating and perhaps futile activities. They were exhausted by trying to conform to the standards of their mainstream culture. Again, following conventional patterns where one works hard to seek a good salary, following manners which allow one to integrate successfully into one's community. For these men, such activities were frustrating and futile. They were much more interested in fantasy as a kind of escape from these pursuits. They were much more interested in sensual pleasure as an escape from these more mainstream pursuits. They saw the purpose of life ultimately as a constant press to avoid ennui, deep boredom. And later in Dorian Gray, Harry himself says the only sin in life is ennui. If you are giving over to your boredom, what are you bored at? You're bored at the Philistinism of mainstream culture. You're bored at how didactic and self-righteous, optimistic your mainstream culture is. This exhausts you. This bores you. So what do? You seek sensual pleasure of any kind to help elevate you from your boredom into a kind of intensity, indeed into a kind of ecstasy, perhaps. So, in the 1850s and 1860s, Baudelaire, Gautier develop these ideas. They start articulating an aesthetic of decadence, meaning that one should pursue a life that is opposed to the righteousness of the mainstream, that is opposed to the desire for health that is constantly expressed by the mainstream. If your society, if your mainstream society is seeking righteousness and health, and these endeavors lead to exhaustion and frustration, then seek the opposite. Seek decay, seek decadence. And again, the main way that Baudelaire and Gautier suggested one do this is through intense minute-to-minute sensual pleasure. Not systematic pursuit of sensual pleasure, not deliberate, disciplined pursuit of sensual pleasure, but a giving over to the whims of one's senses, being open for whatever comes next. There are two primary types of the decadent aesthete for a Baudelaire and for a Gautier. One is the flaneur. The flaneur is one who idly wanders around the city, walking the city streets with no other purpose in mind than to enjoy whatever sights flash before him, looking for intense sensual experiences. So again, there's this sense of idleness, laziness, wandering, seeing what will come up without overtly attempting to make something happen. Another form this decadent aesthetic took around the time of Baudelaire and Gautier would be the fantasists, artists who would escape into fantasy, to go where their mind took them. And often this journey into mental fantasy could be aided by narcotics or alcohol. But again, the idea of letting the mind wonder what will wonder into fabulous realms that may have no purpose in the everyday waking world, no value in the everyday waking world, but simply are ways to escape ennui. So the pinnacle of French decadence would be the 1884 novel by Huysmans called Au Rebours, which is often translated as against nature, sometimes as against the grain. But this novel is about a character who essentially retires from mainstream society. He lives in a kind of hermitage, and all he does is cultivate sensual experiences for himself. And these experiences become increasingly exotic and increasingly fantastical. The chapter in Dorian Gray, I think it's chapter 11, where we read of Dorian cultivating all of these sensual habits. He gets interested in jewelry. He gets interested in music. He gets interested in perfume. He gets interested in cloth. Anything that will keep ennui at bay. Well, this chapter is based very clearly on this novel by Huysmans called Au Rebours. When Harry gives Dorian a copy of a yellow book in Dorian Gray, a yellow book that corrupts, we might say, Dorian into going more deeply into sensualism, many think that this book by Huysmans is mint. French novels that were lascivious were often wrapped in yellow paper as a way to signal to readers that, well, this might be naughty. Maybe you don't want to pick it up. And in England around the time of Wilde in the 1880s and 90s, there was a journal in England called the Yellow Book, which basically published writers in the decadent tradition. Not Wilde, strangely enough, but writers in Wilde's circle. So So now we understand how decadism connects to aestheticism. I've talked about aestheticism in another lecture. Um, I think the difference is that aestheticism ultimately has a kind of positive spin on the pursuit of beauty. There's a sense that if you take the aesthetic point of view, you might be able to detach yourself from fear and desire to the point that any experience can be a beautiful, intense, exhilarating experience, that one can have a kind of successful worldview. One can reach a kind of enlightenment by following aestheticism, insofar as it is a path that encourages one to detach from fears and desires that can lead to anxiety and sadness, and ultimately lead one to be so attached to anxiety or sadness that one can't experience the beauty of life. But if you can detach and see yourself as a spectator and not an agent, a spectator in the world which exists for you as potential work of art, again, that's a kind of positive way of seeing the world. Decadence focuses more on those parts of human experience that we might say are not necessarily admirable. Again, idleness, laziness, escapism, narcotics in some cases, just anything, no matter what, to escape boredom. So we might say that aestheticism is a move towards something, and decadence is a move away from something. Would be a way to think about it. So it should be clear by now that Wilde, in the Picture of Dorian Gray, is clearly steeped in the decadent tradition. Sir Harry, in some cases, seems to embody decadence. Certainly Dorian, in that chapter 11, clearly embodies the decadent tradition. And it's just another context for thinking about the novel, not only as a narrative that is exploring various ways of experiencing the world, but also as a novel of critique, because that's always implied by the decadent movement, and that is the mainstream society is not fulfilling. The mainstream society is not nourishing. It is ultimately superficial. It is ultimately materialistic. It is ultimately predictable. It is ultimately uninteresting. So one way to rebel against this is to propound values that are the opposite of it. Propound values that are the opposite of the mainstream values. And again, if the ultimate goal of mainstream society is righteousness and health, then to choose to be decadent would be a way of countering those particular values.